Hello and welcome to Access and Privacy Online. In this segment you're about to hear, FIPA President Mike Larsen, Executive Director Jason Woyada, and I, Patrick Farnsworth, share what stories we'll be following as we look ahead to the new year. Enjoy. I think something that's been sticking in my mind because it's been coming up in some of my other research that I do, mainly out of the US, but kind of looking at how these laws that are coming up, it was mentioned in some of our recent rundowns, but there was a recent legislation that just was enacted in Australia where they basically do a social media ban for, I think, 16 and under. We haven't really from how I've read the script, how it's been written, we haven't really gone into some of the implications of that because we're kind of just reporting the news on that. But I'm curious because this has been a trend across the board. We're seeing certain laws being, or forms of legislation and other things that are coming up in the U.S. in particular around this as well, ostensibly about children's safety online, which I think anyone would agree is an important issue. But it's often kind of couched in a lot of this moral panic, which is more of a cultural thing. And how the implications of that is not just for children, but for everyone online. So I'm kind of curious where that's going to go in the next year. It's somewhat of a complicated subject, but regardless, it is, dealing with privacy issues and age verification and all of this stuff. I'm really curious to see where that's going to go and how that's going to manifest in Canada, if it does at all. What's going to happen there, because obviously what's happening is governments are observing what's happening in other places and seeing what laws are being enacted there and creating their own versions of that in their own countries. And so that's something that I'm really just curious to see, that the direction that's going to go in particular. Yeah, and then just some of the stuff that's really started in this past year and just spilling over into the next year, regarding these bills that we've been really focusing on in Canada. And so yeah, that to me is just not super specific, but just generally speaking, just seeing how these trends, and I think the fact that we're going to do this podcast and continue to do it at the pace that we're doing it allows us to kind of slow down and look at the details a little more. When anyone who's just sort of reading the news or listening to podcasts to get the news, it's a bit overwhelming. So I think having sources of information that are a little more measured and take the time to go over the details is going to be increasingly more valuable for the information consumer, the person who's analyzing this information. Just having sources that are measured and calm as things get increasingly more chaotic, seemingly.
Good points, Patrick. As someone who teaches courses on moral panic and media literacy, I'm happy to hear that mentioned. Yeah. And this is a true challenge, right? Because if you look at the expansion of surveillance powers that infringe on civil liberties and have increasingly intrusive capacities to gather personal information, quite often these are rationalized as measures necessary to protect young people, right? To address online harms, and particularly with an emphasis on youth. And indeed, I mean, pretty much every expansion of police powers, throughout the last 50 years is justified by a need to provide further protection for youth, including in terms of things like drugs and other domains like that. But the danger with that is that, of course, we do have this completely legitimate, very reasonable expectation that governments will play a fundamental role in protecting young people. Who doesn't want to protect youth? The challenge, of course, is that can short circuit serious conversations about this kind of creeping power of surveillance. And I'm really worried about that in the context of online harms. On the one hand, you have increasing exposure of young people to the most insidious forms of data collection, but also, serious online harms around things like deepfakes, the non-consensual distribution of intimate images, which is an area that I study. These are really serious harms, and there are very few checks and guardrails that prevent people from accessing that kind of content. So, something ought to be done. And then the question is, what is the something? And there's lots of ideas in play, everything ranging from social media bans, as we see in Australia, as we see kind of discussed in England as well and elsewhere, through to forms of verification, user verification, age verification, which would involve huge personal information collection, likely through third-party private sector platforms that I have absolutely zero confidence in being able to maintain, data security and protect personal privacy. So that is a landmine for personal privacy and also for freedom of expression, right? Other things there too. And then there's also this idea, well, maybe we could address this by having greater responsibility for platforms, right? Maybe making sure that some of the places that host and produce and offer this kind of content bear some responsibility for harms associated with it, which I think actually is an idea that has lots of merit. But this year we've seen some of the limits of Canada's ability to hold non-Canadian platforms accountable for harms that are clearly in violation of Canadian laws. This goes back to, this goes back before this, but of course the Clearview AI case we see this with. We see this recently in British Columbia with efforts to hold social media platforms responsible for non-consensual distribution of intimate images online and running into limits of our ability to actually effectuate takedowns and banning of certain kinds of content. So this issue, right, of local jurisdiction to deal with very serious local harms in a globalized, borderless data world where increasingly the kind of algorithmic media oligarchies are more powerful than many states. That is going to be a tough knot to untie. And I can see a lot of ways, as you mentioned, that's going to pop up in the year to come. I'm looking forward to it. And on a bright side, I always worry when we start to see calls for greater surveillance because of won't somebody please think of the children, because this is an old story that's been repeated many times with potentially some very serious implications. But that being said, I was really heartened and I remain heartened as we go into 2026 by recent announcements by the federal and provincial information privacy commissioners across Canada about a renewed effort to really focus on youth and educational platforms, data privacy around that, and also around media literacy. Right, as something and misinformation, right, as issues that are connected to our digital media landscape and our privacy rights. And so it's great to see those threads being gathered together. And I think there's some really potentially positive impacts that could come from that. I'll be keeping an eye on that as the year goes forward. And maybe one more thing before I turn it over to Jason here is, I teach as an educator. I teach an advanced course on surveillance and privacy issues. And one of the things I'm looking forward to doing in January is actually having my students check in on the podcast. As an educator, I'm looking at all these ways to ensure that I can bring students up to speed on information and privacy issues. And, these are issues that haven't really been owned by any disciplines, right? If you look at in Canada, anthropology, sociology, criminology, where I'm from, none of these really say, okay, information and privacy is our domain specifically. So you can do an advanced degree in any of these fields and really know quite little about information and privacy rights, which means my job is to give a pretty good crash course on the state of affairs, right, where things are right now. And there really is no better resource, to be honest, for doing that than saying, listen to our podcasts. We summarize, all the best stories, all the most important things that are taking place on a weekly and ongoing basis. So as an educational resource, there's no competition for that in the Canadian stage right now. And that's, I think, a good reason for a feather in your cap, Patrick, and for the team.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, and I think as we're looking at known unknowns and there's going to be this whole dynamic of the election or elections this year, right? And things in 2026 that we aren't quite sure about, right? Like you get into this known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, and we don't know if there's going to be an election in BC.
Can I say I didn't know that you were going to be quoting Donald Rumsfeld in this podcast, but thank you for that.
It predates him, but you're welcome. It's come up a couple of times. Every once in a while, I get to drop it.
Yeah.
But yes, and it's always good to be aware of those types of comparisons. But yes, like BC's provincial election, a possible federal election in Canada again, a possible federal majority rather than a minority government. Like these are all dynamics that are going to be playing out on on the political scene here in Canada that have massive implications for access and privacy. And that's before we start considering Alberta succession. Or the discussion around that. Because regardless of the Alberta succession debate, the Alberta legislative and legal frameworks have definitely been aligning more to a U.S. stance and position in terms of the implications to personal information and access to information from the state and from the province in that respect. And those have far-reaching implications across the rest of Canada if we see those changes echoed in other provinces and treated as aspirational rather than cautionary. Right. And so, what I've been finding fascinating is because of the monitoring that we're doing and the reporting on a weekly basis, you're able to see this play out in real time and on a week to week basis, look at how that legislation is coming in and how that's then echoed in other jurisdictions and who's drawing from what. And, I have to say, like, I have been looking at influencers and I come from a broadcast background. And so looking at how all of this plays out in the modern media framework, I've never been more appreciative of legitimate sources of information like mainstream media. Because you can turn to the Canadian press and you can turn to the major outlets and know that what you're getting is going to be a reporting of the facts. And it really speaks to how certain elements that are trying to drive propaganda and particular narratives will work to undermine legitimate sources of information, whether that be academia, whether that be mainstream media, and whether that be the government. And it's important, I think, that when I'm looking into 2026, that we continue to recognize the importance of civil society and what that means living in a community where we're all trying to get through as best we can, and keep making those changes. So there's a lot of things there I think that we can sink our teeth into. This Bill C4 is going to continue to be a major driver for us into 2026. I know that already. And then with these other elections that we're looking at, those are going to be major factors. And just the growing influence of AI and everywhere I've gone in the last 6 months, and I know Mike and I have been talking about this, data sovereignty is increasingly coming up and relevant to people because they want to be able to control their personal information. And governments are going to be remiss if they don't recognize that shift in public concept around this, because there is a general unease that is settling into Canada in terms of the US and how much information we store there, who has access to it, and why. And the US is no longer framed as an ally that is absolved of and always defaulted to. I don't think in a Canadian perspective, I view the US as any more safe for my personal information than Russia or China or other foreign powers at this point, based on where their information may be. And this is played out in a whole bunch of debates and ongoing discussions. And people have heard me make that comment before, and I will continue to raise it, that it is a false equivalency to say the US and China are the same. Absolutely. However, there are corresponding concerns in storing our data in either the US or China. And those need to be recognized. And that is an equivalent concern for Canadians, I think. And so that concern is grounded in fact. The respective threats and risks may be slightly different.
Access and Privacy Online reviews the headlines and delivers deeper commentary on a regular basis. Be sure to subscribe to get the full episodes every week and get notifications when we release show segments and other commentary throughout the week. We look forward to hearing from you soon. Have a good one.